by Harriet Longdale. Read by Hayley Mills.
The telephone by her bedside rang once, then went quiet. Then it rang again. Natalie Sims glanced at her wristwatch before rinsing her mouth and replacing her toothbrush in its mug. Then she glanced at herself in the bathroom mirror, patted her face dry with one of the fluffy pink face towels her Nan had given her 19th birthday 2 weeks ago, and padded towards her small bedroom to answer the telephone. "I wonder who in Hades would be ringing me at this time of night," she muttered to herself, as she threw the towel down on the foot of her bed and reached for the telephone. "Hello," she whispered into the mouthpiece, hiding her mild irritation. Could it be that bearded computer engineer who flirted with her so outrageously in the office yesterday morning? Certainly not. Where would he get a new number from? "Hello?" she said again when nobody responded. She waited. Then she suddenly felt vaguely uneasy, even afraid. She'd never really liked telephones. They always seemed to represent some unseen threat. Ever since her mother died and she was told by telephone while on holiday in Florida. "Is anybody there?" she asked bravely, but her voice had become slightly hoarse.
"You're Natalie Sims, aren't you?"
She bit her bottom lip and looked around the room, but she was very much alone. She'd only moved into this small apartment that very morning. It was to be her first true home, a place of her own after all the years living with her father ever since her mother passed away. Her dad was none too keen on the idea of his only daughter living by herself. She had decided the time had come for her to prove her emotional and financial independence. Who wishes to know? Who wishes to speak to her? Who is it?" she managed to say, although her throat felt constricted. Her knees felt weak, and she had to sit down on the bed.
"Does it matter? I know you're alone, but don't be afraid. It won't make matters any easier if you're afraid. You don't know me, but I know you. You live on the 3rd floor of the building, flat number 37, and you have red curtains and a white ceiling with no shade on the center light. You've just moved in, haven't you? I could help you with the decoration, Natalie. I could put up some shelving for you. I'm good with a hammer and a chisel. I have strong hands. Are you there, Natalie? Are you listening to me?"
Her mouth had gone dry and she tried to swallow but couldn't. Tears welled up in her eyes. She was truly afraid now, but also brave. "Look," she managed to speak after a few efforts when no voice would come. "I don't know who you are and I don't care. I can report this to the police and they can track down this call with ease. Stop this, do you hear me? Don't call again." She slammed the receiver back onto its cradle and covered her face with her hands. Her entire body was shaking. Then she collected herself and got up from the bed, rushed to her small sitting room, pulled the new red velvet curtains shut, and switched off the naked overhead light. She stumbled back to the bedroom, stopped in her tracks, and returned to the as-yet uncarpeted sitting room and headed for her front door and checked the rather flimsy lock. On her way back to her bathroom in order to dry her hair properly, the telephone rang again. Her body went rigid. Should she lift the receiver or just let it ring? She decided to steel herself against that hateful, intrusive sound and entered the bathroom where she splashed her face with cold water. Then she remembered that she'd left her towel on the bed. The telephone was still ringing. Now anger got hold of her. How dare a stranger invade her privacy like this? Without further hesitation, she ran to the bed and picked up the receiver. "Look, I'm going to call the police if you don't,
It won't do much good, Natalie. I'm in a public phone booth just across the street from you. They'll take their time as usual, and by then we can be good friends, if you'll only have the good sense to invite me up. By the way, I saw you at your sitting room window a minute ago. Why did you have to close them? You look real good to me."
Natalie realized for the first time that she wasn't wearing anything. She reached for the towel and covered herself as she glanced towards her bedroom window. Thankfully, the curtain was drawn. You should be ashamed of yourself, whoever you are, she cried into the mouthpiece. Why can't you leave me alone?
We have a little bit of business to settle first, Natalie. You owe me something.
What do you mean, Who are you, anyway? How come you know my name, my address? Natalie heard herself saying. She couldn't help herself. She still experienced a feeling of outrage, of her privacy being invaded by a complete stranger. It was not a comforting feeling. Then she collected herself. It would be better and more sensible if she kept calm or better still, she would just replace the receiver and refuse to answer the telephone if he should ring again. Then she could call her father and ask him to come over and collect her. No, that wouldn't do either. It would be an admission that she could not cope living on her own, and that not even after one night away from the family home and Dad's smothering protection.
Natalie, be sensible. I want to see you. I must see you.
The voice broke through her tangled thoughts. Look, whoever you are, if you don't stop pestering me like this, I'll call the police. I'm going to do it now. She slammed the receiver down onto its cradle. She was shivering, despite the warmth of the small room. Then she jumped up from the bed, switched off her bedside light, and rushed over to the window. She pulled the curtain aside and peered down into the street. She could see the public telephone booth, the diffused light inside, and the dark figure moving away from it towards her building. She dropped the curtain and switched on the bedside light, then hurriedly found her telephone address book and flicked through the pages. Finally, she found what she was looking for, the number of the local police station. She took a deep breath, then she dialed the number. In what area are you? She replied to all the questions and then tried to explain her situation as best she could. We understand your dilemma, Miss Sims, the police officer on duty explained patiently and rather condescendingly. But unless this caller of yours actually does something criminal, we can't do anything about it. She explained that she just moved into the new flat that very morning and that this was the first time the calls had been coming. The officer was still non-committal and urged her to report again should the mysterious caller persist in causing a problem. Then he bade her good night. She dropped the receiver in its cradle. The silence in the building around her became oppressive. If only she had neighbours. But it was a newly erected building and she was the first tenant to take possession. The only one. She sat rigidly on the bed and waited. The silence around her became a threat in itself. She leant over and switched on her bedside radio. She took a sip of water, put on her filmy and silky new pyjamas, and climbed into bed. She tried to read one of her magazines, but then realised she could not concentrate. She put it aside and switched off the light. Who could have made those calls? Somebody she knew. It had to be. He knew her name, her address, even her telephone number. One of her male friends, perhaps. She laughed to herself despite her unease. Male friends, indeed. Her possessive dad, bless him, saw to it that she, Natalie Sims, had never even had what one could call a steady boyfriend. That was another reason why she had to leave the family nest. Too much control. Too much questioning from her dear, caring dad. Sometimes his caring had become oppressive. That is why she had to make a statement of her own. That is why she could not bring herself to call him at this moment. Maybe tomorrow. Suddenly her thoughts veered towards that bearded computer engineer again. The way he looked at her. It was what she would call a funny look. A kind of knowing look. And when he smiled at her, she wanted to respond, but just for a fraction of a second. There was something about that smile she didn't like. She couldn't explain, not even to herself, why she felt it to be a bit creepy. A bit too intimate. She didn't quite know how to react. Eventually he shut his sleek, slim instrument case and departed, but not before he'd given her one more glance. "I think he likes you," giggled Nancy Smith, the girl beside her in the typing pool. "Why, he couldn't take his eyes off you." "Oh, don't be silly," Natalie replied. "Who is he, by the way? Does he work here?" "Hard luck, Nat," Nancy replied. "He is from the computer maintenance company, and they always send somebody new. A different fella each time. You will probably never see him again." An ambulance screamed by in the street 3 floors below and recalled Natalie from her reverie. Damn, she was nearly asleep. Such disturbing sounds at night were few and far between where her dad lived in the big family house out in the leafy suburbs. She turned onto her other side and closed her eyes again. If only sleep would come. But then, for no apparent reason, she thought of the time when her father was caught up in some involved business matter that apparently went wrong. Her mother was still alive then, and even though Natalie was only a small girl, she could still recall the nights when her dad was apparently unable to sleep and her mother kept him company in the study down below. She could hear their muffled voices. And one night there was a car in the driveway which took off with screaming tyres, and what sounded like a shot rang out. She never knew what had caused that one upset in their otherwise tranquil existence in that comfortable old home. The incident was never mentioned again in the family. But then she was wide awake again. She sat bolt upright in bed. There it was again. A sound at her front door. She waited. She'd stopped breathing. She was straining her ears. Was it her imagination or... No. There it was again. A gentle knock on the door, and a voice calling out to her, a muffled voice. She recognized it. Her blood ran cold. She went rigid from head to toe as blind fear took possession of her. Thank God the door was locked. She emitted air from her lungs, slowly, silently, and waited. There it was again.
Natalie, open this door.
She couldn't utter a sound, much less move. She stared into the darkness of the room and began to feel slightly dizzy.
Natalie, if you don't let me in, I'll have to force my way in. I know you're alone in this building, so why not be a sensible girl and open up?
There was a distinct new edge of menace to the voice. She managed to move her feet towards the side of the bed. Then silently and slowly she felt for the floor with her toes and got out of bed. She came upright and moved towards the closet, but it was full of her clothes, hastily bundled in that morning during the move. Then she chose the window and moved behind the curtain, covering her body with it. But her feet were sticking out at the bottom and...
Natalie, it won't help. I know you're in there.
Her fingers reached for the window catch. She turned around and looked outside. Below the window was a narrow ledge, just a few inches wide. If she could get out and somehow... But she'd always been afraid of heights, and the street below seemed very far away in the dim light. Then she heard the sharp, dry crackle of wood breaking. Fear was once again gripping at her throat, and her heart was banging against her ribs. "Please, please go away," she heard her own strangled voice pleading. "Please, please leave me alone, please." But hardly any sound came from her lips. Oh, if only she'd locked her bedroom door. "I'm coming to get you, Natalie," she heard him say, followed by his approaching footsteps across the bare floor of her small sitting room. With bated breath, she crouched down in front of the window. Her entire body was now shaking with fear, and cold sweat was making her shaking hands clammy.
Don't be afraid, Natalie. What we have to do will not take long, and I'll try not to hurt you too much. I'll make it quick.
"Please, who are you? Why me?" But her voice was hardly audible. She could see his dark form in the glow through the curtains from the street below. He was approaching her, stealthily, slowly, like a stalking animal. She couldn't see his face. He was wearing a dark balaclava, but she could see an icy glint in the hollows where his eyes would be. He was only a few feet away from her. Desperation gave her the strength to pull herself upright, fumble for a second or two with the window catch. She opened the window hastily and climbed outside. Another second or two, her toes found the cold ledge and she dropped herself onto it, still clinging onto the windowsill.
Don't be stupid, Natalie, you'll fall.
He obviously didn't expect her to try to escape in this way. Desperate to get away from him also made her let go of the windowsill. She flattened herself against the wall next to the window on the outside of the building. She edged away, one small step followed by another. She didn't dare look down. The night breeze was cold as it chilled her shivering body through her flimsy nightclothes, but the tears on her cheeks were hot. Then she saw the sleeved arm and a black-gloved hand reaching out of the bedroom window towards her.
You're doing a very dangerous thing, Natalie.
Holding herself tightly pressed against the cold, hard wall of the building, she felt a bit safer. Perhaps he would hesitate to risk following her onto the ledge. Slowly, but egged on by sheer fear of him, she moved further along the narrow ledge, still resisting the temptation to look down, but she could not control the sobs which were now racking her slim body as she clung to the wall and kept moving further along the edge. Anything, just to get away from him.
I had to do this, Natalie, because of what your father did to my dad. Your father thought his money could buy my dad's silence, but I will never forget what it did to him. He died a broken man, and all because of your father. I swore vengeance then, and when I found your name, your number, and your new address on the office computer system, I knew the time had come. Your father loves you, doesn't he? If anything bad should happen to his daughter, well, that would be fair vengeance, wouldn't it?
The bearded computer engineer in the office. So she was right. Her intuition had tried to warn her. She remained quiet, and inch by inch, she kept moving further and further away from the window. She was beginning to feel nauseous. 3 stories below, another ambulance screeched by, followed by a police car. If only... She tried to scream, but the scream died in her throat as her left foot slipped. In desperation, and in danger of losing her balance completely, she reached out and managed to grab hold of the sill of her sitting room window. Her strength, however, was not enough, and she felt herself losing her hold. Willing herself not to lose her balance, she looked down for the first time. The space beneath her took on the appearance of a bottomless chasm, with the streetlights twinkling below. They seemed to be an eternity away. Then she slipped and lost her balance completely. At that moment, the window above her opened, and his gloved hand reached out and grabbed her by the wrist. He pulled her body, now limp with fear, up and into the open window. Once inside, he laid her down on the bare floor, slapped her face, and turned to shut the window.
You're a very stupid girl to have tried that stunt. You should have known you won't get away from me. We have some unfinished business to complete, you and I.
She realized that this was her final chance to get away from him. Mustering all of her strength, she scrambled up from the floor and ran towards the front door of the flat. She reached for the doorknob and tried to open the door, but the doorknob came out of the door. She could hear the intruder behind her muttering and swearing in the dark as he fell over a chair. A glass vase fell from the coffee table and shattered on the floor. He swore again. She reinserted the doorknob, turned it, and pulled. The door opened, and she found herself outside in the passageway, leading towards the lifts. The lifts! Once again she thought of the caretaker on the ground floor, who seemed to be perpetually missing, apparently making the rounds of the building. She decided against the lifts and the stairs, as her pursuer would definitely catch up with her. Blinded by fear, she ran in the opposite direction, towards the large ornamental windows which marked the end of the long passage. She could hear his muffled voice calling out to her and his hurried footsteps gaining on her. They sounded hollow and full of menace in the silence of the vast, unoccupied new building. When she reached the bright windows, she hurled her body against the expanse of gold-tinted glass in a desperate effort to get out of the building and away from her pursuer. She heard the faraway sound of a security alarm going off somewhere in the building as the shards of broken glass fell onto the floor around her. She could taste the salty warmth of blood on her tongue, and her head was aching and spinning. Then she lost all consciousness. Natalie Sims woke up at noon the next day and became aware of the fact that she was safely huddled up in bed. She pulled the sheet aside and peered around the room. Pale green walls, other beds. She was in hospital. "How are you feeling, Miss Sims?" someone inquired. A nurse. "Your father came to see you this morning, but you were still resting. He said he'd come to see you again later." What happened?" asked Natalie wearily. "You don't know? You seem to have had a small accident during the night. The caretaker said he thought you may have walked in your sleep and fell against a glass window. But don't worry, no real harm came to you. A few cuts and bruises, but you'll be fine in a day or so. Fortunately, he found you because you were bleeding a lot. Now, how do you feel?" For Natalie, the next few days passed in a confused blur. Nobody seemed even to want to believe the details of what had really happened around midnight in her flat that night. Not even the police officer who came to interview her twice. Her father seemed furious with her for creating such an irresponsible incident, as he called it, and added that it was clear proof that Natalie was not yet ready to be responsible for her own well-being and living by herself away from his care and her family home. Then she remembered the state her flat had been in. The overturned chair in the sitting room, the broken vase, the open bedroom window. She called the nurse. "I was coming to see you in any case," the nurse announced. "We've decided to discharge you. Now, don't you go and have any more bad dreams, okay? Sleepwalking can sometimes be very dangerous." Natalie bit her tongue. "Detective Sergeant Wilkins is waiting for you. He would like to escort you back to your home. Rather nice of him, don't you think?" the nurse continued as she helped Natalie get dressed in some of her old clothes from the house her father had left at the reception desk. "He just wants to ask me more silly questions," Natalie said bitterly. "Why won't anybody believe me? I didn't walk in my sleep. It really happened." "Oh, it's nothing to feel bad about," the nurse remarked offhandedly and handed Natalie the flowers Nancy and the girls at the office had sent. Natalie didn't say anything. Actually, she felt like crying. Detective Sergeant Wilkins didn't say much in the car either. When they reached her flat on the 3rd floor, the front door was shut but left unlocked. "I just want to have a quick look round," he said curtly. "If you will wait out here, please, miss, I won't be long." After a short while, he reappeared. He left the front door open for her to enter. "Everything seems to be in good order, Miss Sims. Absolutely no sign of disturbance, except you had left your bedside radio on. Been listening to any scary radio plays lately?" he asked crisply. Before she could utter a sound, he departed. She stared at his tall figure fast receding down the passageway towards the lifts, with the words still unformed on her lips. What about the broken vase? The chair? The open bedroom window? Filled with hurt and silent humiliation, she entered the flat and shut the door behind her. The key was back in the lock, on the inside. She looked around the sitting room. The chair back in its place. Only the glass vase, which she was sure had been standing on the coffee table, was missing. Nor were there any broken pieces on the clean floor. With a soft cry of frustrated disbelief, she ran into a small kitchen and looked inside the bin under the sink. Nothing there either. Then she ran into the bedroom. Her bed was neatly made, and the window was firmly shut. In fact, there was absolutely no sign that anything untoward had disturbed the serenity of the flat. Had she really just dreamt it all? Had she really sleepwalked into the passage outside and walked into the ornamental window at the end of the passageway? Were they, the hospital, the police, even her father, all right and she was wrong? Had she actually imagined or dreamt it all? Feeling very tired and very much alone, not to mention completely confused, she flopped down onto her bed. Then the telephone rang and stopped. She held her breath. She suddenly felt very cold. Her lips began to tremble. Then the telephone rang again. A muffled animal-like scream of naked fear gurgled up in her throat. She jumped up from the bed, stumbled, regained her balance, and ran to the front door. She reached for the door handle to open it, but the handle came away in the palm of her hand.